3, 2, 1. 57talk.com. Gary Cubetta back again. It is, let's time date this. It's July 13th, 2010. Larry Matysik. Larry, we're going to do the second half of 1961. We left off with Buddy Rogers winning the NWA championship by defeating Pat O'Connor in Comiskey Park, 30,000 people there.
Yep, June the 30th. A day that will stand either infamy or fame, depending upon whose side of the issue you're on. It's funny, as you go back to the notes, the original information on the show is that it drew 42,000 fans, paying $140,000 gross. Think about this, the psychology of the finances there. That's less than $4 per ticket on an average. Whoa, you don't see that today, do you? Of course, it was 50-some years ago. Then over the years, we've heard 34,000, we heard 36,000. 30,000 we know were there. So the real number, which nobody will ever know, even though some people will say they know, nobody knows. It's somewhere probably in the low to mid 30,000s. Rogers wins 2 out of 3 falls. The first fall, Rogers catches O'Connor in 8 minutes and 30 seconds with a high knee lift. Think of Triple H with his high knee, to which he always gives Harley Race credit for the high knee. The truth is, Harley Race copied the high knee from Buddy Rogers. So nothing's new in wrestling. Second fall, O'Connor wins in 6 minutes with a reverse rolling cradle. Third fall, Rogers takes the title. O'Connor misses a drop kick. Rogers covers him in just about 7 minutes. And Buddy Rogers, after a 15, 16-year career, one of the biggest draws in the wrestling world, is now the NWA heavyweight champion, for better or for worse.
As a 13-year-old, how did you hear that Buddy Rogers had become the NWA champion, world champion?
It was in the newspapers, the Globe Democrat and the Post-Dispatch, the next morning.
Oh, wow, okay.
And, of course, and as I found out later when I started working for Sam Muchnick, that the night of the show, as soon as he was notified, he always made sure first that the local papers were notified. And he, in particular, had a good contact with the Associated Press. They would hopefully they would put it on their news line all over the country when it was a big deal. And there would be a telegram sent to every promoter in the alliance, hopefully that they would talk to their local newspapers. So there was a notification system done by the NWA, done by Sam Muchnick out of St. Louis when the title changed hands, and that's what happened here. And I read it in the newspaper. There it was, Buddy Rogers, world champion.
Did it surprise you?
Yeah, at that age. I mean, obviously I had no clue about the politics that were going on or anything. I knew Rogers was a major star, but they hadn't really said anything in the St. Louis promotion that he was going to challenge for the world title in Chicago. If anything, I had it in my mind after he beat John Paul Henning in that great match in June of 1961 before another sellout at Kiel Auditorium, that probably Rogers would wrestle Pat O'Connor here in St. Louis. A little naive because there were a lot of politics involved, but Rogers got the belt, and he was the man. July
15th, TV taping, Wrestling at the Chase, the Corazon Room.
Mm-hmm.
NWA champion Buddy Rogers defeats Guy LaRose.
And so he's now made his first appearance in St. Louis with the belt. And on the tag match right after that, Ronnie Etchison and Bobby Graham winning from Cowboy Rocky Don Lee and Tyro Miyake, with Etchison winning both falls in the tag match because Etchison was going to be the first challenger for Buddy Rogers. Etchison was not a big name. He was returning to St. Louis for the first time in probably 4 or 5 years, his first time on television. He'd had a pretty good run in Western Canada, California. He was not a dynamic star. He was one of those steady professionals. And after he had a little run here in 1961, by 62, 63, he was settling into that mid-card, preliminary card match where he was just your favorite uncle that you could cheer for in the second match. But at this point, he was going for a title match. And during the summer of 61, on different TV shows, he was getting victories. For instance, on July 22nd, Ronnie Etchison and Bobby Graham went against killer Buddy Austin in a handicap match where Austin agreed to win one fall from each man or forfeit the decision. He starts out against Bobby Graham. He pins Bobby Graham, but then Etchison comes in the second fall, and Etchison pins Buddy Austin, who's a pretty good name, building up at that point. Etchison pins Austin in 14 seconds. Another name I mentioned who was working TV here that summer, Joe Hamilton's brother, Larry Hamilton, who eventually became the Missouri Mauler and wrestled in Florida and Carolinas. Did pretty well there in main events. He was going to get a minor push here in St. Louis.
July 29th, the Alaskan defeats Mario Milano, Wrestling at the Chase, next edition.
And I had to mention Mario Milano because he would have pop up here on St. Louis TV now and then for the next several years, usually in the summer, And, of course, Milano was a huge star in Australia. Not so much in 61 yet. He really came to greater prominence probably a couple of years down the road. And I believe he might have had a little bit of a run up in the East Coast in the old WWF for a little while. But here he was working St. Louis TV and losing to the Alaskan, Jay Yark, who, again, was a high mid-level to low main event type heel.
August 11th, 1961, Kiel Auditorium. Attendance 10,800 as NWA champion. Buddy Rogers makes his first defense in St. Louis against Ronnie Etchison.
And Rogers comes out on top, winning 2 straight falls. Etchison could not continue after losing the first fall to Rogers' figure 4 grapevine, which, of course, everybody knew was a killer hold. It was destroying knees right and left. And in this case, it took Ronnie Etchison out after the first fall. Rogers with a big victory in his first outing, and a little excitement underneath that in a tag team match where John Paul Henning and Cowboy Bob Ellis went against Buddy Austin and Johnny Valentine. Now you figure that would be a pretty even match, right?
Yeah.
Instead it was 2 straight falls. First fall, Henning pins Valentine. Second fall, Ellis pins Austin. The problem was Valentine and Austin were arguing throughout the match. Valentine hit Austin once by mistake. Austin hit Valentine once by mistake. The team fell apart, and by the end of the match, they ended up in a battle, which, of course, was leading to Johnny Valentine making a turn from heel to babyface.
Buddy Rogers, were you happy to see Buddy NWA champion just as a fan?
Yeah, I think a certain amount of stagnation, lack of a better word, had set in with O'Connor as the champion. Again, we've talked about how, Pat as an in-ring performer clearly was among the very top people in the game at that time. Whether he was the type of dynamic drawing card that you would like for a world champion is another question. Lou Thesz was a solid wrestler too, but there was something in Lou Thesz, the personality as it came across, that would draw money that with Pat O'Connor would be okay. Pat didn't do badly as a world champion. He drew okay, but he didn't set any records either. And he'd had the belt for a couple years. It was time to make a change, and Rogers was a completely different person with the belt. Strutting, blonde, bombastic, arrogant, the master of getting real serious heat. So Buddy Rogers was definitely a different flavor when he became the champion.
August 16th, 1961, TV taping. Danny Hodge versus Rip Hawk.
And they go to a time limit draw on TV. Again, just Hodge being such a well-known performer. Here he is on TV on Wrestling at the Chase going to a time limit draw, a 10-minute draw with Rip Hawk. And later on the card, another 10-minute match, John Paul Henning going to a 10-minute draw with Gene Kiniski. So a match that had 4 pretty strong names for television.
Did Gene Kiniski ever look young?
Well, Joe Garagiola never described him as looking young. He always said, even back then in 1961, he's got a face like a blocked punt. He looks like a football that got blocked. He's a blocked punt. So I guess he looked like a football that had been blocked, but he was fresher leather. As he came along, the leather became more aged. He never really looked beautiful, let's put it that way.
Wednesday, August 23rd, 1961, TV taping. John Paul Hennig defeats Rip Hawk.
And Hawk's still right in the middle of everything. And it's funny, and I guess if anything I wanted to indicate as I drew up in the record book here for St. Louis, how Hawk could maintain his drawing power even though on television he would lose matches. Not a lot of them, once in a while, or he'd have a draw with somebody, nothing against Danny Hodge, but Danny Hodge was not a main event performer in St. Louis. Hawk somehow had the personality that in the early 60s, he didn't necessarily have to win every match, and it kind of should put to rest to some extent the theory that the heel always has to win by cheating or something. Well, a lot of it's personality, a lot of it's performance, and Rip Hawk just did it, because here he was losing to John Paul Henning. But over the next year and a half, we're still going to see Rip Hawk in main events at Kiel Auditorium, and they're going to sell out the building.
Now, there's a big break. August 11th was the last show at Kiel, which was the first Buddy Rogers defense in St. Louis against Ronnie Etchison. And then we have to go to September 20...
September 22nd.
Okay, I went too far. September 22nd. There was a big break between the shows back then.
Yeah.
At times.
At times, and I'm surely it was planned, and I'm sure that the building Kiel Auditorium wasn't in that much necessary use at the time, but it just worked out that way, and then that's how Sam laid it out, and again, he was successful. Here we are coming back on September 22nd through 10th. We haven't sold out now since we had that run of 4 straight sellouts in St. Louis earlier in the year, but here he is coming back with 10,800, pretty close to a sellout in August, and now on September 22nd, 10,804, again with a triple main event, a, quote, super spectacular card. And there's 3 main events, and a lot of people can probably guess what they were, at least what one of them was, right? Yeah. Buddy Austin and Johnny Valentine.
And Buddy's right in the main event here.
And both men getting disqualified, the match getting out of hand, the 2 blondes, and Valentine kind of sliding into that favorites position a little bit. You see that happening. Pat O'Connor, by that point, is now being billed as the U.S. champion. At the NWA convention in August of '61, they decided to name O'Connor the U.S. champion, which was what Rogers had called himself when Rogers was not the world champion, so basically they traded positions. O'Connor defended the U.S. title against Larry Hamilton, not known as the Missouri Mauler then yet, but still they had a good match.
Yep.
O'Connor pinned him right in the middle. And the third main event, Cowboy Bob Ellis beating the Alaskan.
Jay York or Mike York or different?
That was Jay York. Mike York was the younger brother. Mike will pop up here on St. Louis cards probably in about another 2 or 3 years.
And then in another match, Lorenzo Parent defeats legendary Tarzan Tyler.
Tarzan Tyler was in St. Louis a lot there. Of course, we talked about Lorenzo Parenti as a real local favorite. And ironically, and it's interesting you brought him up, if you also look at the TV, you'll see Parenti was having a nice run of wins. Here he is in September 2 beating Carlos Rodriguez. Here he is September 9th beating Joe Tommaso. Here he is on Kiel Auditorium beating Tarzan Tyler. Parenti was becoming the popular person in the middle, and it's kind of funny. I hadn't thought of it till Parenti said it to me when we talked almost 50 years after that. He said, "Don't you remember Sam gave me that long winning streak on TV where I only lost 1 match?" And, of course, take a look at September 23rd, 1961 on Wrestling at the Chase, Gary.
Buddy Rogers, NWA champion, defeats Lorenzo Parente. When he was counted out outside the ring. So he didn't even pin Parenti. Wow.
And Parenti, I'll tell you, Parenti was a good, solid little performer. He was small. And he would have certainly fit into a junior heavyweight division with a Danny Hodge, and that's why he'd worked down there for a while. But again, a strong TV show because not only are Rogers and Parenti into it, Cowboy Bob Ellis and Bobby Graham, we've talked about him a little bit, winning from Rip Hawk and the Alaskan when Ellis pinned Hawk.
Larry, back then, did you as a 13-year-old, did you differentiate one TV from another? Like this was a really good one, and this, or did it matter? No, some were better than others. I recognize that, and as of course, you want at that age, certainly as a teenager, you want every card to just be dynamite. As you get a little bit wiser, you learn that it's just like just doing a concert. When you put a concert together as a singer or a musical group, you have your hot songs, then you have your ballads, and you take them up and you take them down. And that's, of course, how TV has to be, too. I mean, September 23rd was loaded. Rogers, Parenti, count out of the ring, that tag match, plus John Paul Henning and Buddy Austin, 2 main eventers going to draw on the card. Yeah.
Yet there were some other TVs that were kind of so-so, and those things happened. But, sure, some stick out in my mind. Some I look at and go, ooh, that was kind of nasty. But not so, it's funny. I look in the 60s, I don't see it as often. Part of the reason being Bobby Bruns shared with Sam Muchnick the idea that as a booker, and you'll see it more and more as we get deeper into the 60s, the matches on television should be competitive. So there were strong preliminary people in there going against main event people, where when Pat O'Connor became the booker, and this is not a knock, it's just a difference in philosophy, he came from the thinking where it's more of a squash, and the guy who went against the main event performer was really not much more to Jim Broney. Of course, that led to some things because then Sam would go in there complaining and saying, look, I don't want these guys to be wash rags. That was Sam's favorite word for just guys who couldn't even make a match out of it. I don't want wash rags in that ring. But the sad part of the matter was that's really all they were. They couldn't do the things that a Thor Hagen, a Tyro Miyake, a Lorenzo Parente, a Tarzan Tyler, who's a main event performer in a lot of places.
And Larry, you're talking about some of the later 70s stuff, right, into the 80s?
Right, some of the later, and anybody who listens to when we talked about especially the mid to late 70s, and some of the TV shows, and I'm sure I complained plenty as we did those interviews, Gary, saying, "Ooh, God, some of those TVs." I was doing the commentary then. How did I get through those? Oh, that was an ugly, ugly show because there was a 13-minute match and 3 guys in the ring in a tag match. Only one was worth anything, and the other 3 were just, ooh.
Well, Larry, I remember
difficult.
in the early 80s, I don't know if it was the late 70s, but the early 80s when we traded tapes, VHS tapes, I remember the St. Louis shows. And they were kind of notorious for, there'd be a good match, a really good match slipped in every once in a while, but a lot of the matches just were not that interesting, and it wasn't like a Mid-South Buck Robley, Bill Watts, every match a main event type of situation. So you're saying in the 60s there was a little bit more of that?
Well, certainly a little bit more of the competitive part.
Yeah.
Not shooting angles. Now, Watts' stuff, Buck Robley's, they shot more angles. We didn't shoot that many angles, and Sam Muchnick didn't shoot that many angles in St. Louis. But that's because he wanted, when he shot that angle with John Paul Henning and Buddy Rogers, or with Johnny Valentine and Buddy Austin, he wanted it to mean something. Why would you shoot an angle between 2 mid-level guys? They're not going to draw you any money anyway. All you've done is waste the idea for the angle. And if you want proof of that, take a look at TNA or some of WWE promotions booking today. Some of the stuff you're shooting angles with guys that couldn't draw money. If they had, I don't know, gold painted on them and people could lick it off, it's that simple. So you wanted to be selective with the angles, and that's what St. Louis Sauce was. And I know, and Buck even said to me sometimes, they draw, you didn't shoot that many angles. But if we had competitive matches, and that's certainly what happened throughout the 60s more and more, as they really got into the idea of how to use television, that they built something around wrestling that wasn't just always bumping the referee, always running somebody in. It was 2 guys fighting for something that meant something, a victory. And victory meant something. Losing meant something.
Well, Buck told me one time that if Sam had ever given him the book, the first thing he would have done was brought in Abby and brought out the blade. So I don't know how that would have worked.
It wouldn't have worked. I'm going to tell you right now, with all due respect to Buck, he would have bombed.
Yeah.
It would have bombed because Abby wouldn't do finishes. Abby wouldn't give you a finish, and St. Louis would reject anybody who didn't do a finish.
Yeah.
They'd have said, "What kind of crap is this? We've just been cheated out of our money." The St. Louis fan felt he was cheated out of his money if he didn't see somebody win the main event 1, 2, 3.
Well,
and to say it doesn't work, well, wait a minute. We're going to look at all the attention. We've now had how many hours of interviews already?
Yeah.
And it's proven over and over that that theory works. It doesn't always have to be blood and guts.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go to October 6th. That's the next one. 1961, Kiel Auditorium, 11,562 sellout. NWA champion Buddy Rogers versus the great Cowboy Bob Ellis.
I guess I shouldn't complain about the attendance figures, should I? Here we started the second half of 1961, 10,800, 10,800, 11,562. That ain't so bad, is it? Rogers winning 2 out of 3 falls. This time, Ellis and Rogers split falls, but the second fall, Rogers won with the figure 4 grapevine. Ellis injured the knee, could not answer the bell for the third fall. Keep that finish in mind for what's going to happen later in 1962 when things will develop with an angle involving things you could do with the figure 4 leg lock that somehow would come back to life again 10, 11 years later between Jack Briscoe and Dory Funk Jr. Keep this finish in mind from October 6th of 1961.
I first saw Cowboy Bob Ellis in 1975. He was never in with Vince Sr. in WWF, but I did see him with the IWA. And even at that extended period of his career, he still looked really good. He must have been great in the 60s.
In the 60s, he was terrific. Had a terrific body. He just understood the concept of the comeback. When he'd get angry, everybody knew it. And when he'd come back, there was fire. And it's just something you can't teach. You can sit there with a young wrestler forever and say, you got to sell, you're a baby face, you sell, that's why we get heat. You make your comeback and you got to have fire. Well, Buck Robley can tell it to him, Joe Hamilton can tell it to him, we can tell it to him, Vince McMahon can tell it to him. But you either got fire or you don't. It's not something that you can just manufacture. Cowboy Bob Ellis was a natural at it. And in his period of time, from roughly 1960, his strong time would have been 1960 to probably 68-ish. He was one heck of a babyface everywhere he went, and he drew money against every top heel he worked with.
October 20th, 1961, Kiel Auditorium, 5,621 is John Paul Hennig, main events against Buddy Austin.
And wins by disqualification, and a babyface match going along with it. U.S. champion Pat O'Connor against Ronnie Etchison. Etchison getting his second main event, and I might add his last main event ever in St. Louis, although he worked here into the 80s. 5,621. Second show in October. Remember what we used to say about that? And it certainly tied in with that. It was tied in with it right here. It was not a real strong show. It got people in the main event that Sam wanted in the main event. It told the story, whatever it was that he wanted to tell. It advanced things a little bit. But he was also willing to say, we've had a real hot period here. Let's take a deep breath, have a good card, have a solid card, but we don't need Abdullah the Butcher on there running around juicing and not doing a finish.
So Larry, you're here October 20th, 61. It's obviously a little bit weaker show. There's no NWA champion. John Paul Hennig doing well. What's your reaction that night to see a show like that? Do you take it in stride, or are you like...
Look at it in stride. You could always find something in there that you would like. There's a name on there, Hans Herman, who had a great run in the 50s, loses to Cowboy Bob Ellis. There's a guy by the name of Marquis de Paris, who had some different matches around the country, and I thought was supposed to be a pretty hot-shot guy. He comes in here and he loses in the second match to Lorenzo Parenti.
Yeah.
Parenti getting another win. So there were these little, for me at least, as I was trying to learn and maybe starting to learn, I should have probably been paying better attention to my first-year high school algebra class. But nonetheless, you're trying to learn some things. There were things you could take out of this show. The crowd went home satisfied, and that was fine.
In 1961, second half, did you know where Sam's office was? Did they say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you knew it was the Claridge Hotel. I mean, I was just, I couldn't drive yet. I was only 14 years old.
Yeah.
So I knew generally where it was, and it's to me, Claridge Hotel, Taj Mahal, same thing.
No difference. Okay,
no difference. Same deal.
November 4th, 1961, TV taping Wrestling at the Chase. John Paul Hennig and Lorenzo Parenti go to a draw with Fritz von Erich and the Alaskan.
And Fritz von Erich just popping up out of nowhere for one show. This probably was the time when Fritz was making his inroads into Dallas. He was getting involved in a promotional battle in Dallas to a certain extent. My guess is because he's just on one show out of nowhere, Sam obviously said, hey, we're going to use you on the TV. It lets people know you're alive. And again, for a television taping that also had Buddy Rogers, the NWA champion, on it, the Alaskan Lorenzo Parenti going to draw Buddy Killer Austin with a victory. And you have a tag team match going to draw John Paul Hennig and the very popular Lorenzo Parenti against Fritz von Erich and the Alaskan. Once again, it made for good television. It was exciting. We didn't need blood and guts. It was exciting. It was the Cardinals playing the Cubs in a heck of a ball game that went to the ninth inning and was won with a go-home home run by Stan Musial. So it was a good television show.
November 10th, 1961, Kiel Auditorium, attendance 9,770. Johnny Valentine versus Buddy Austin in a Texas death match.
Let's see, that's the third Texas death match in St. Louis, if I'm not mistaken. Only the third one in a year and a half. Valentine getting the win, finishing Austin off with in the Texas death match, a single main event. So when you look at the undercard, not that tremendously strong of an undercard. Yukon Eric making an appearance, and he had a pretty good reputation at the time. He was the Alaskan strongman who eventually, two things with Yukon Eric. He was the guy who lost his ear to Killer Kowalski when Kowalski came off the top rope in Montreal and caught Yukon Eric on the side of the head with his knee, with his leg, and tore Yukon Eric's ear off. And Yukon Eric, of course, then sadly became involved as an alcoholic and committed suicide not too long after this. But at this point, he was still a pretty good attraction, and Sam was going to take a look at him, see how he did. And look at that opening bout, Gary.
Gorilla Monsoon, Bob Marella. Now, what did Gorilla look like in 1961?
Pretty big, pretty heavy, no beard, awful young. Bob Marella, fresh from college, a college wrestling star, which, of course, Sam loved. And Sam and Marella became very good friends. They were, even when I was working for Vince McMahon in the 80s, And Gorilla Monsoon, Bob Morella, Gino Morella, was working for Vince McMahon. I mean, Sam and Gino were always close. They'd always make sure to get together when we'd have something with Vince in town, and Morella and Sam would always get together. He liked Bob Morella. He was young and green here. He wasn't going to be a main eventer over the next year and a half in St. Louis. And from here and other areas he was working, he moved to, of course, New York and became Gorilla Monsoon, who would wrestle Bruno Sammartino.
Now, this is very interesting because I started watching wrestling, let's say, 71, 72, and by that time, Gorilla had already kind of wound down his career. He would wrestle occasionally on TV, but not that often. But to think about this, he really started as Bob Morella. I thought he had started earlier than this in 61. He didn't have that long of a career in the ring, so to speak.
It's interesting you bring that up. I hadn't really thought of that. He probably, I'm assuming he'd probably been wrestling a year or so before this. Usually Sam didn't just take a guy right out of the amateur stage. He probably has had some other activity, and I'm sure somebody who really wants to dig into it could find wherever he'd wrestled in 1960, I would guess, maybe even in 1959. But it's interesting. Morella was a smart guy. He understood the business. Don't forget, he was part owner of the WWF, and he had to be bought out by Vince McMahon Jr. when McMahon started his drive in the early 80s. So Titan Sports, and before that Capital Sports, Bob Morella owned part of that company. So somewhere very early in his career, after his run with Bruno, he made sure he bought in, and obviously he was smart enough that Vince McMahon Sr. was impressed with him and let him buy into the company. You don't just let somebody buy points in your wrestling promotion in your company unless you've got a lot of confidence in him and a lot of respect for him.
Okay, fair enough. November 24th, 1961, Kiel Auditorium, 8,141, NWA World Champion Buddy Rogers versus the great Johnny Valentine.
Rogers wins 2 out of 3 falls. In the third fall, Valentine loses his temper and gets disqualified. I would say that house may have been a little bit of a disappointment, because Rogers and Valentine actually had some history from the 1950s here in St. Louis when Valentine was starting out. They'd been partners, they'd been enemies, and then, of course, they'd been partners here in St. Louis again in 1960. Here they were enemies again, Valentine coming off his big win over Buddy Austin in a Texas death match. Probably a little bit of a disappointing house, although you can't complain about 80% of capacity. The card underneath, not incredibly strong. Yukon Eric beating the Alaskan. John Paul Henning and Lorenzo Peretti beating Stan Stasiak and Duke Hoffman. And then a match again that you have to look at from historic standpoints. Don Leo Jonathan pinning Bob Morella.
Wow.
Who's now being billed as Gino Morella. He's picked up the nickname Gino, Gino.
I asked you about Gorilla before. How do you work in the ring? Was he good to watch in the ring?
I don't remember him as being spectacular. A lot more amateur stuff. He was a babyface, so he wanted to take people down. He wanted to wrestle a little bit, but he could do the big man thing. And, of course, in this case, Jonathan would be used to knocking somebody over with a body, with a flying tackle, and they could work that where against Morella would hit Jonathan with a flying tackle, and Jonathan wouldn't sell. Jonathan would hit Morella with a flying tackle, Morella wouldn't sell. And then eventually Jonathan just, you could see, and I do remember this as we talk about it vaguely in the fog of my mind of many, many years ago, you could see that Don Leo Jonathan had been in there longer than Morella, and he knew what he was doing. And I just remember him being so much more aggressive than Morella in taking the match. But, of course, he was a star at that time, and Morella was learning.
Did you ever look at Don Leo back then and think he might be NWA champion?
I don't know that I ever thought of him that much. It's funny, as we go through, you're not going to see him on St. Louis TV that much, and it'll be interesting just as we talk about how Don Leo Jonathan is used over the next 10, 12 months in St. Louis. And I don't think you ever really thought that. I kind of guess in my head I would have expected him to have a title match with Pat O'Connor when O'Connor had been the NWA champion.
Yeah.
I just didn't feel that intrigue for a Jonathan Buddy Rogers, even though both were heels, and there was never a problem with Sam putting heels together. If heels are baby faces, his theory always was, if we proved these are the two top guys, well, they want to see them wrestle.
And I ask you about Don Leo because it's funny, a lot of the guys we're talking about, some of them would really struggle trying to fit into today's game, but as you said in the previous program, Don Leo, if he wanted to, wouldn't struggle fitting in anywhere in wrestling history, right?
No, not at all. Athletically, I mean, he had it all. He had size, And, I mean, you can't teach 6'5", 6'6". He was athletic. Probably the biggest question would have been the standard politics, and I think Don Leo was pretty much an individual. Would he have put up with some of the baloney, some of the backwoods politics that sometimes happens in different promotions? I don't know if he had the patience to put up with that, where some perhaps did more than others. But Jonathan, just on pure athleticism, pure ability in the ring, pure working ability, could he have been a star in any era? Geez, yeah.
And Gino Morella in the opening match defeats Tommy O'Toole.
And now we're into December 8th, 1961.
Yeah.
And the crowd doesn't draw all that well. 57-83, double main event. And, of course, U.S. champion Pat O'Connor beating Buddy Austin, who was counted out outside the ring. O'Connor hitting that drop kick when Austin's on the apron. Again, I remember that. And I do have it on my notes, which probably helped. That's maybe why I remembered it. Who knows? But then the co-feature on that one, John Paul Henning and Don Leo Jonathan, in a match that just gets out of hand, and both are disqualified.
Yeah.
So in my young mind, I'm sure thinking, well, I guess they're going to go to Hennig and Jonathan down the road and settle their feud. But they really didn't.
Yeah.
And so, again, here was that case. If you were going to push Don Leo Jonathan, for a world title match, well, the logical thing is he just had this double disqualification with John Paul Hennig, who hasn't lost since he had the match with Buddy Rogers. Wow, well, why wouldn't you have them wrestle again? Jonathan goes over in all our amateur booking minds, which all of us have, every one of us at every point in our life. Well, Jonathan can go over John Paul Hennig, then he'll go with Jonathan against Buddy Rogers. It can go that way, though.
Larry, how close was Buddy Austin to a Buddy Rogers?
Not that close.
Not that close.
It's kind of interesting on Buddy Austin. I mean, my picture in my head of Buddy Austin is a tough guy. Blonde hair, a little bit of Buddy Rogers, a little bit of strutting, a little bit of blonde hair, a little bit of Killer Kowalski, and that he could really be rough, but without the real, and once again, we're into these very subjective judgments of people. It's not something you can quantify objectively, but not ever the real flair of Buddy Rogers.
Yeah.
Buddy Rogers, one of his famous things, of course, was bouncing off the ropes, his opponent waiting there with either a big fist cocked or ready to do a drop kick, and Rogers putting on the skids, stopping, and strutting around the ring, having avoided disaster. Something when Buddy Rogers did that, the look on his face, he didn't do it to get a laugh. He didn't do it to get a twinkle in the eye, which sometimes Ric Flair did when he did it. Rogers did it to get everybody mad. He'd stolen the spot from the babyface, and when he'd strut around that ring, it was, I'm smart, you're stupid. Buddy Austin couldn't do that same way. It didn't get the same kind of heat if he'd even tried, so he didn't. Killer Kowalski, who Buddy Austin picked up part of that nickname too, when Kowalski was on the offense, it was like a machine gun running amok. Kick, punch, kick, punch, oh, right on top of you, pound, pound, pound. Austin did not have that relentlessness. On the other hand, you could look at him and see he's a pretty tough old bird. So you respected him, but he wasn't at the level of a Kowalski, was not at the level of a Buddy Rogers. But he was good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not burying the guy. I'm not putting him down. I'm not saying he was no good. I'm just saying he wasn't at the level of Rogers and Kowalski, and that's why they're in the Hall of Fames that count.
With the help of a time machine, if Buddy Rogers and Ric Flair had been given the same opportunities during the same, let's say, during the 80s, could Buddy Rogers have held his own or surpassed Ric Flair? Or you saw them both, or was just Ric Flair just superior in many ways?
Rogers would have held his own.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Rogers, I don't think, was quite the athlete that Ric Flair was. But keep in mind, I'm seeing Ric Flair when he's 28, 30 years old. We're seeing Buddy Rogers now, and I'm seeing him in 1960, 61, 62. He probably started at 45. So he's in his late 30s, maybe 40 years old. He's past his physical peak a little bit, but he was so smart, again, at getting heat, at knowing what things you had to do and when you had to do them so that it mattered the most. Buddy Rogers would have gotten over without question, unless the politics somehow buried him, which, of course, can always happen. Although Rogers was a pretty good political player, he managed to end up on the right side. It's funny, Irv Muchnick had talked to Buddy Rogers late in his career, and he said, Buddy Rogers wasn't the smartest guy at all. He was not a real bright guy. I said, well, yeah, he's pretty smart in the ring. He said, I'm not saying that. And Irv said, you talk about the ring, and you could see this light kind of pop into Buddy Rogers' eyes. He understood that ring. He understood crowd control. And again, just as we talked about having the babyface making that comeback with fire like Cowboy Bob Ellis, getting heat is also something that you can't always teach. We have a young guy here who works independent shows, Jim Hoferth. He wrestles at the Big Texan in the St. Louis area right now. And Jim's a great guy, big guy, and we always got to push him. Be aggressive. Be aggressive. Be aggressive. But it's not his nature. He's a nice fellow. And to be a heel, a big guy, he's really got to push himself to be aggressive like that. Well, you never had to push Killer Kowalski or Gene Kiniski or even Buddy Rogers to be aggressive. When Rogers went on the attack to get the heat, he knew how to do that too. It wasn't just the look. It wasn't just the strut. It was the way he laid in the punches. It was how he got himself into position to do these things so that everybody could see it and everybody could get mad about it. Just something you really can't teach. Some guys just have it. Just some guys are Pujols, and some guys are the backup first baseman at for the Chicago Cubs. I don't know.
December 29th, 1961, last show of the year. Kiel Auditorium attended 7,548. Pat O'Connor, John Paul Hennig, and Johnny Valentine versus Rip Hawk, Don Leo Jonathan, and Buddy Austin.
Very interesting six-man tag match. Interesting on a couple of levels here. Sam had this period for about, probably 2, 3, 4 years where he would run a show during Christmas break. He generally had been leery of it, so it also meant that he was often running a show back-to-back because our first show in 1962 will be January 5th, so this was a back-to-back show. Didn't draw badly, though. You never knew how it was going to draw, and some of the reasons were he had a fair amount of guys who did live in the St. Louis area. This allowed them to be home or close to home during that weekend. But in this case, you have a pretty intriguing political six-man tag match, and listen to how the falls break down. The first fall, Don Leo Jonathan pins John Paul Hennig. Remember, they had the double disqualification on the last show. Second fall, Valentine pins Buddy Austin to even the match of one fall apiece. Valentine and Austin, of course, had the Texas Death Match feud. Third fall, interesting, John Paul Hennig pins Don Leo Jonathan. Now, they never really got to the single, but here we were having that match and that tag match ending with Don Leo Jonathan doing the job for John Paul Hennig. And I want to find, if I can in my notes, that exact match. I want to see exactly how I described that third fall. Probably not a real long description, but it's enough. Let me get to it. Okay. Hennig pins Jonathan with a back body drop to win the match. If I remember, Jonathan did a finish where he would basically have an upside-down bear hug on the man, which was, I guess, akin to putting him into position almost for a power bomb now. You put the head between the legs where you can either go to the pile driver or pick him up into a power bomb. Hennig slides deeper underneath the man, lifts Jonathan up, back body drops him, bridges over him, and he pins Don Leo Jonathan. So it's a clean pin, and really it kind of puts Hennig over. Even though they've traded falls, the fall you probably remember as the fan going home is the fall where Hennig pinned Jonathan to win the match. Hey, that John Paul Hennig. Boy, look at the names that are in that match. Jonathan, Austin, Hawk, O'Connor, the former champion, Valentine, who just got disqualified against the world champion. That Hennig still got the goods. He won the fall that won the match. Yep. Interesting, and that's kind of the position Jonathan was in. And Jonathan still would have some other matches coming up down the road in St. Louis, and one interesting one that I'll just mention will tease everybody down the road. Don Leo Jonathan against Lou Thez. I always thought it was interesting the people who Sam Muchnick put Don Leo Jonathan against in main events. This case of John Paul Hennig, who was a pretty tough character, and later down the road against Lou Thez. And as we both knew, as everybody knows, Lou wasn't going to do it unless he wanted to do it. So that could be a pretty stiff situation. Not that I ever heard any argument about Jonathan in terms of doing things, but it just seems to me, looking back now, with a certain different perspective on the business that I've been in now for 40-plus years, they were being a little careful with some of the things they did with Don Leo Jonathan. And I wonder if there was a complete trust of Jonathan to go all the way with him. I don't know that. I have nothing I can look back at to base that on. I just asked that question. I wonder, there's just a little hesitation about Don Leo Jonathan.
Larry, 1961, black and white, small televisions. How many channels would you have gotten back then?
Probably 5. Let's see, ABC, CBS, NBC, those three, KPLR TV, and then there was an educational channel, the PBS channel here. Probably those 5 stations, and UHF was just in its infancy. So what turned out to be Channel 30, I think it was a different channel in those days, different number, was probably just starting, but I doubt very many people could get it.
And you only got the St. Louis Wrestling show on TV, right?
That's all. Well, they still may have been running Texas Wrestling at that point on, I think, the ABC affiliate. That still may have been showing up. But those films, those tapes, were easily 4, 5, 6 years old.
Did you watch them or so interested?
It was wrestling. I watched it.
You watch it. Was there
Never know what you learn. Never know what you see. And it's funny, we talk about what they drew in 1961. We had that great run of sellouts in the first half. And here in the second half, a good start to the fall. A little bit of a cooling off towards the end. But at the end of the year, the average attendance for Kiel Auditorium cards was over 9,100 people a card. The building seating 11,000. And with standing room only, you get 12,000 in it. Point being, your average card drew 85% of capacity. Who does that today?
Well,
anybody?
No, because it's just everything's turned upside down in the world.
It's a different business. And, of course, it's all about pay-per-view. Understandable. And there's no way there is no cap on a pay-per-view. But wait till we get into that's the first part of 1962 and see some of those attendance figures, and then into some of the controversy that will erupt at the end of 1962.
Larry, 1960, 61, is your interest ever waning in wrestling, or are you just fully hooked?
I'm hooked, but I'm also hooked on baseball, and I'm certainly hooked on the St. Louis Hawks and the NBA. I was a sports freak, and how many of those listening in many ways were the same? I'm sure many of us were, and whether it was hockey, basketball, football, didn't matter.
What year did the St. Louis Cardinals start in St. Louis?
Well, the Cardinals, of course, were there forever. The Hawks, the St. Louis Hawks, probably came in the early 1950s, mid 1950s, something like that. But they were building into their really big years, 59, 60, 61. And that was the Bob Pettit, Cliff Hagan era, where they were having the battles, as we talked about with the Boston Celtics and the early teams with Elgin Baylor from Minneapolis before they became the Los Angeles Lakers. And now we're doing some nostalgia on NBA basketball. Oscar Robertson, the big O at Cincinnati. God, what a player he was.
Did you go to the basketball games?
All the time.
Oh, you did?
Yep, all the time, as often as I could. Not as often as we went to wrestling. There were more of them, of course.
Did you see Wilt Chamberlain in the 60s?
Yes, I did.
You saw him live?
Yes.
Would he be able to play today?
Sure. I mean, everybody, it's apples and oranges, but everybody, a great athlete like Wilt Chamberlain would have adapted to the game today. It's a different game today because I think you have more ball handlers and the mid-size people tend to have a little bit more of it. But Wilt Chamberlain still would have been a dominant center, I think, and he was a tremendous athlete too. And, of course, if he had grown up in today's era, he would have a different background and he would have done some different things that would have made him equally effective. He was a dominant player. Yeah, seeing Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell in their primes, those were fun times, too, over there. And, of course, going to Cardinal baseball. It was a big deal here in St. Louis. I mean, everybody was into baseball. How could you not be into baseball in St. Louis, even though I was in love with the Milwaukee Braves? Hank Aaron, Eddie Matthews, Warren Spahn, Lou Burdett. You know the group. Gary?
By the way, the Wilt Chamberlain question was a rhetorical question. Of course, Wilt Chamberlain would be able to play today, and, of course...
Do you really believe that? Now, be honest. Now, do you believe that?
Oh, he would totally dominate these guys. I believe that. I think that the competition he went up against in the 60s probably wasn't as tough overall. There were a lot of players that, I didn't see it, Larry, but I saw Wilt late in his career, and he was just a powerhouse.
Well, and the one thing, too, keep in mind, a lot of the post players, the low post players in the early 60s, well, Wilt was, 7'1", 7'2". A lot of low post players then were 6'9", 6'10". So Wilt really was bigger, where today you have a lot of 7-footers who can go up and down that court. They never asked Wilt Chamberlain to go up and down the court like that. Well, I would think as an athlete, especially in his prime, he could have done it. Could Wilt Chamberlain have been a wrestler? Hey, if Ernie Ladd could do it, and we'll be talking about Ernie Ladd in about 5 years, if Ernie Ladd could do it, Wilt Chamberlain could have done it too. Can you imagine Wilt Chamberlain in there with a drop kick?
Larry, we finally found our sequel to the 40 years of St. Louis wrestling. We're going to do year by year of the National Basketball Association. You and
Nothing
me, what do you
wrong
think?
with that. We could have some fun with that too, and we wouldn't even go on ESPN with a special about how we're going to leave town.
Thank you, Larry. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Gary.
The sooner we do another show, the better. Talk to you soon.
1962 coming, and we're going to start right with a sellout.
Okay.
Talk to you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.